Hello everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation to present at this symposium. It was really an honor to be invited. South Africa is near and dear to my heart. My wife and I were married in Cape Town in 1998, and we traveled through Citrusdal and the Cedarburg on our honeymoon, so I really wish I could be there in person. Today I'm going to speak to you about the evolutionary history of dairying and the way that milk consumption shaped human evolution. I'd like to divide this talk into 4 parts. I'm going to start by talking about the unique aspects of the human diet, then talk about the origins of dairying, what we know about the very first milk-consuming populations, and then I'll talk about the impact of milk on human evolution, what we know about how it shaped human genetic and biological diversity, and at the end I'll focus a little bit on the enduring legacy of ancient diets, how the pattern of ancient milk consumption shapes the human variation that we see today. Humans have very unique energy demands compared to other animals. We have large brains that are about 3 times the size of other primates, but our brains also use about 10 times the energy of other animals to function, even while we're at rest. In contrast to that, we have a really surprisingly small digestive system compared to other mammals, and our stomachs and intestine are not well adapted to fermentation. This means that many of the potential plant foods that other animals or other mammals eat are indigestible to us. With that small, simple gut, the type of food that we eat really matters. But there's a problem in that energy-dense and highly digestible foods are really rare in the natural world. Before the advent of farming, our hunter-gatherer ancestors got this high-quality food from hunting, fishing, and foraging, and in South Africa by eating shellfish and mongongo nuts. But cooking is also a really important part of most human diets because it helps to break down complex proteins and carbohydrates in food, making it sweeter and more energy-rich. All of these features of our diets help to fuel our large brains and build up fat stores, which help us buffer periods of low food availability or famine. The origins of agriculture, which developed independently in many parts of the world over the past 12,000 years, really fundamentally changed our relationship with the natural world. Instead of relying on a wide range of animal and plant resources, we shifted to a few domestic crops and animals. And growing our own crops provided high energy and relatively stable food sources. But this also narrowed our dietary breadth and meant that agricultural diets were often nutritionally deficient and susceptible to crop failures when there are droughts or unfavorable environmental conditions. There's good archaeological evidence that most plants that now form the basis of global farming started as less productive wild forms and then slowly evolved over time into domestic variants over hundreds and thousands of years. And all of this occurred globally within particularly the last 10,000 years in a relatively stable period of the Earth's climate. The farming of crops and the domestication of animals are really closely linked. In many parts of the world, including South Africa, herding preceded farming. And in all major regions where there's farming today, herd animals coexist with domestic plant species. Recent research by Robert Spengler at the Max Planck Institute in Germany suggests that many of the progenitors of domestic plants, such as flax, millet, maize, and buckwheat, had indigestible defenses that prevented human consumption. And that's really on account of our simple and non-fermenting guts. But this also suggests that herd animals were really crucial to the evolution of farming because they ate these wild grains, and it's the process of their digestion of these sort of drove the evolution of plants into more digestible forms for us. So this is a really new perspective that puts herd animals at the very center of ancient cultural change. In that light, what can we say about the origins of dairying and the use of dairy products among ancient farmers? What were they really using these herd animals for? I first personally became aware of the importance of dairy products to human survival about 20 years ago when I was doing archaeological fieldwork in the Jordan Valley. While I was there, we visited a Bedouin family for lunch. They were goat herders that moved throughout the year to bring their goats to different pasture. The lunch we ate consisted of flatbread that had been baked over an open fire and yogurt that had been fermented in a goatskin sack. At the time of our visit, it was in the middle of the dry season, and there was very little for their goats to eat. The previous evening, the family had arranged for several bags of feed to be delivered to their site to help feed the goats through that dry season when there wasn't very much grass. To stop the goats from eating all the feed all at once, the family had put some fencing around the feed so that the goats couldn't reach it. Overnight, one of the goats had jumped into the fence and broken its leg. My relatively naive mind concluded that the goat would be put down and eaten, as you couldn't really herd an animal that couldn't walk. But after our lunch, the woman who had served us lifted the goat up into her lap, and she took some of the dough that she'd set aside from the flatbread that she'd made and that we'd eaten for lunch. And she then set the bone in the goat's broken leg and wrapped it really tightly with the dough, and then proceeded to bake the dough onto the leg with a candle, making a kind of a cast or plaster to set the bone and heal the leg. And watching her do this made me realize that the goat was far more useful to this Bedouin family for its milk than it was for its meat. And that made me rethink many of the kind of Western assumptions I had about herd animals and their value, and made me think much more about the importance of milk and dairying in the past for human survivorship. Herding and dairying were extremely important to the way that we changed our relationship with the natural world over the past 10,000 years. By domesticating animals, we were protecting them from predators, but in return, we used their genetic adaptations to expand the range of the human diet. Herd animals have large and complex digestive systems that allow them to eat grasses and other plants that are indigestible to humans, and they convert those grasses into milk, a secondary product that is rich in energy and protein. Essentially, the herding of animals allowed humans to survive and move through environments where there was very little to eat, processing the environments around us into rich and renewable sources that really bring along food with us as we travel. It's like having your own, having herd animals is like having your own supermarket with you wherever you go. It converts natural resources that's inaccessible to us into digestible resources. The herding of milk producing animals, though, is really important to human diets, but there's a catch. Most humans can't really digest raw milk. All mammals produce an enzyme lactase, or beta-galactosidase, which cleaves indigestible lactose molecules into digestible sugars. The production of lactase, however, is typically lost when we're weaned from our mother's milk. As adults without lactase, the lactose molecules have an osmotic effect in our large intestines, fermenting and causing bloating, diarrhea, and discomfort. Some people, however, are lactase persistent, in that they maintain the ability to produce lactase into adulthood. This means they don't have the side effects of milk consumption, and meaning that they can drink milk in higher quantities, but they also get about 50% more energy from the milk that they drink. We can see evidence of the importance of herd animals in the domestication of taurine cattle, goats and sheep, but also buffalo, yak, and zebu. Once people domesticated and herded these animals, they migrated with them to other parts of the world. Today, the consumption of dairy products is pretty much ubiquitous globally, particularly through the production of yogurt and cheese, but also through the consumption of raw milk. But the big question is, where and when did people eat cheese, yogurt, and drink raw milk in the past? What do we know about that, and how can we piece that together from archaeological evidence? Recent archaeological studies of ancient pottery, spanning the last 9,000 years throughout Europe, showed a pretty startling finding. This study by Richard Evershed and colleagues demonstrated that pretty much every ancient pot found across Europe throughout many thousand years showed evidence of milk proteins. They appeared earliest in southern Europe, but milk consumption seemed to have gradually moved into Central and Northern Europe over several thousand years. We know that animal milk was important as a weaning food. If you look at this pot that looks like an animal on the right, this was an infant milk bottle found in a child's grave, and it contained cow milk proteins, showing that babies were fed cow milk. But the fact that all other pots also had milk residues demonstrates that milk was also important to the diet of adults. But what were they eating? The process of making cheese and yogurt involves fermentation, a process that creates lactic acid that consumes lactose. And this is typically followed by mechanical separation of byproducts, which further lower the lactose content of the products, making dairy products more digestible for humans. But what about raw milk consumption? Since raw milk contains high levels of indigestible lactose, was anybody consuming this? And if so, where and when? So in that context, I'd like to talk about the impact of milk on human evolution, how the changing patterns of human culture around diet and dairying influence the pattern of genetic diversity in our species. We can find evidence of where and when human societies relied on the consumption of raw milk through the pattern of human genetic diversity today. The production of lactase, the enzyme that helps us digest lactose, is controlled by the LCT gene, a protein coding region on chromosome 2. And several genetic mutations upstream from the LCT gene regulate its expression and then promote lactase persistence into adulthood, allowing people who possess these variants to digest lactose in greater quantities throughout their adult lives. Higher frequencies of these genetic variants are found in Western and Eastern Africa, Arabia, the Indus Valley, and Central and Northern Europe today. And these are the regions that sort of highlight in yellows and orange and red in this plot. And in each of these areas, milk consumption is culturally important today. But in the past, they also seem to be areas where milk consumption may have buffered famine and provided energy for human growth and reproduction. So why has lactase persistence evolved in these areas? One of the problems of making cheese and yogurt is that it takes time. As important as these sources of food are for survival, in times of starvation and famine, time is something that you don't have. And it appears that human populations consumed raw milk for survival, as it would provide the energy and protein necessary, but without the side effects. Milk consumption would have been an important factor in human survival in times of famine, however, but it also enhances reproduction by mitigating maternal risks in inhospitable environments. We know from data today that mothers in milk-drinking societies typically start producing about 2 years earlier, and because they have nutritious food to wean their infants onto, they have shorter interbirth intervals, which means they have more children over time. And with reproduction being so important to human evolution, something that enhances reproduction, particularly in stressful environments, could be a strong driver of natural selection. If we look at the pattern of ancient genetic diversity in Europe today, which is Europe, I'm focusing on Europe because that's where we have most archaeological data, the most research has been done. So it's really a representation of bias in the record. But the data that we see illustrates a very specific pattern of evolution of lactase persistence genes. Within Europe, early farmers migrated with their herd animals and crops from the Eastern Mediterranean or Jordan Valley, areas of Western Asia. But the earliest lactase persistence genes are found among the Bronze Age farmers in Central and Northern Europe. So that's the dark green areas you see in the middle of the map here. The strongest signatures of selection and highest frequency of genes are then found in the north, in the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the Baltics. And in these areas, it appears that lactase persistence was driven by milk consumption as a fallback food, and thus biological evolution was really driven by prehistoric cultural change in these regions. So what was driving people towards milk consumption and away from cheese and yogurt in these regions at the time? There's good evidence that this northern migration of farmers was stressful. Modeling of archaeological data illustrates that as farmers moved into Central and Northern Europe, the pace of their migration slowed down, and the crops they were bringing were not really well suited to the colder environment of the Central European steppe or the short growing seasons of Northern Europe. It took thousands of years to establish farming in these regions, and during that time there were likely frequent crop failures. When we look at the pattern of lactase persistence genes in Europe, we see higher frequencies in central and northern regions, but also we see higher female statures and birth weights in these regions today. So this prompted a few of us, this is some work I did with Jonathan Wells at University College London and Emma Pomeroy at Cambridge, led us to hypothesize that milk in these regions was both crucial for survival of mothers and their offspring, but that it also may have underpinned patterns of growth variation that we see today. In order to test this, we recently conducted a study that compared the patterns of body size throughout the past 10,000 years in the Jordan and Nile valleys, throughout Europe, and in Asia and China to see if different patterns of growth are detectable and whether this is associated with the origins of lactase persistence in these regions. And here I'll focus on some of the evidence for Western Asian domesticates that came really from the early farmers in the Jordan Valley. And these are the domesticates that kind of formed the key species and crops that farmers had in the Nile Valley and throughout Europe. This region of Western Asia and the Jordan Valley, it was really the earliest center of domestication in the world. This is where Neolithic societies first domesticated taurine cattle, sheep, and goats, and started to farm emmer wheat and barley. These were all local species to this region, and they were well adapted to the local ecology. Over the past 20,000 year time frame, when we look at body size variation in this region, we don't see really any change in body size, and it suggests a gradual interplay between the domestication of species and people in that region that was sort of sustainable and local over that time frame, without any particular stresses or shifts that may have driven changes in human body size. Over the past 8,000 years, farmers from Western Asia migrated into the Nile Valley and across southern Europe. Both of these regions feature a Mediterranean climate, to which these Western Asian domesticates were really well adapted. In both regions, we see no significant changes in body size over time. Lactase persistence genes are relatively low in frequency today, and all of this suggests that dairy consumption was primarily focused on yogurt and cheese in these regions. And incidentally, these are really key components of the diet today, with yogurt being a very common staple in the Nile Valley and Western Asia, and cheese being a really common source of dietary protein and energy across the northern part of the Mediterranean. The big question, however, is whether the migration of farmers into central and northern Europe, where we see selection for lactase persistence genes, also shows changes in human body size. In Central Europe, there is a significant increase in human stature between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago, and again from 2,000 to 1,000 years ago. And in Northern Europe, we see gradual and significant increase in stature across this time frame as well. Both of these trends suggest that the timing of increases in body size were associated with selective sweeps for lactase persistence genes, which suggests that milk consumption underpins aspects of cultural, genetic, and body size differences between Southern and Northern European populations in the past, and possibly even today. So that strong selection of lactase persistence genes seems really correlated with the patterns of body size in the past and may constrain cultural variation today. In these regions, we have the strongest selection for lactase persistence genes, but also evidence for slow migrations, harsh climates, and crop failures. It appears that body size variation reflects this ancient history, as milk buffered the environmental stress, but also aided survival and provided more dietary energy. The big question is whether similar ancient events shaped the pattern of diversity in other regions, like Arabia, the Indus Valley, or Eastern or Western Africa. And these are all areas that have high frequencies of lactase persistence genes today, and milk is really culturally important to all of these places. So that link between culture and biology seems really strong. As archaeologists, I would say right now we don't have enough data to really test in those regions. We need large data sets of archaeological material to test the pattern, and unfortunately that only really exists for Europe right now. So as a final note, I'd like to consider the possible legacy of this ancient pattern of adaptation. If we look at the pattern of milk consumption in different countries globally, it's unsurprising that countries with higher numbers of citizens with lactase persistence genes also produce more milk per capita. This suggests that the underlying genetic diversity that resulted from ancient evolution really shapes global markets and consumer behavior today. We can also see that relationships between lactase persistence genes and height today In parts of the world where people have those genetic adaptations, they're typically taller, but they also typically drink more milk. None of this is particularly surprising, I would say, but they continue to illustrate how the patterns of cultural and consumer variation today are shaped by ancient history, migrations, and the adaptations of our ancestors. So in summary, I'd just like to conclude that dairying was really widespread across many or pretty much all human cultures over the last 10,000 years. Secondary products were probably most common, so products like yogurt and cheese, but raw milk seems to have regional variation in its consumption. If we put this into a broader evolutionary context, lactating mammals generally buffer periods of famine and harsh climates, and the emphasis on the use of dairy products in humans enabled human migrations and drove plant domestication. But later, as a fallback food and then a dietary staple, raw milk seems to have been a key driver of human evolution. Different lactase persistent alleles show convergent evolution in different parts of the world, and they correspond with ancient variation in human growth. Looking more at the pattern of variation today, those ancient patterns of adaptation also seem to constrain modern patterns of consumption of dairy products globally. So I hope this presentation has showed some interesting and unique perspectives on the origins of ancient dairying, and that it's provided some thought-provoking content for anyone interested in the history of milk consumption in our species. Thank you very much to all of my colleagues who contributed to this research, and the funding agencies that funded aspects of the bioarchaeological research that went into this over the years. And thank you all for your attention and listening. Thanks.